The ground shook not from thunder, not from any storm rolling in off the Nebraska plains. The sky that morning in September of 1971 was the kind of blue that makes a man believe in God without much argument, wide and clean and indifferent to whatever trouble was happening underneath it. No, the ground shook because of him, because of what he was driving. Let me tell you about Custer County, Nebraska in 1971. If you've never been to the Sandhills region of central Nebraska, close your eyes for a moment and try to picture it. Picture grass, not the manicured grass of a city park, but tall, whispering, blue-stem grass that bends in waves like an inland ocean when the wind comes through. Eldon Pruitt was 53 years old in the fall of 1971, and he looked every year of it, and then borrowed a few from someone else's account. He was not a tall man, 5'9" on a good morning with his boots on. He had the kind of hands that make city men uncomfortable to shake, the knuckles large as walnuts, the palms mapped with callus and old grease that never quite washed out, no matter how long he worked at it with the lava soap. His face was the color and texture of a saddle left in the weather too long. 2 lines ran from the corners of his eyes where 40 years of squinting into the Nebraska sun had carved themselves permanently into him. Eldon had been farming his family's section, 640 acres out on Route 2 east of Myrna, since 1940 when his father had handed him the deed and died of a stroke 6 months later at the supper table. Eldon was 22 years old. He'd had approximately $14 in a coffee can and a mortgage payment coming due on the first of the month. He made that payment and the one after that for 31 years. He ran Hereford cattle on the north pastures, grew dryland corn and milo on the flat ground, and supplemented his income, as half the farmers in Custer County did, with what folks around there called custom work. Meaning if your field needed tiling, your creek needed clearing, your road needed grading, or your draw needed a stock pond dug, you called Eldon Pruitt. And Eldon would come with his cat. That 1947 Caterpillar D7 had been purchased new by Eldon's neighbor, a man named Herschel Vance, for $6,200 in the spring of 1947. Herschel used it hard for 4 years, broke his hip in a loading accident in 1951, and sold it to Eldon for $800 and a half beef in the fall of that year. Eldon had been running it ever since. 20 years by the time this story begins. 20 years of field clearing, pond digging, terrace building, and creek work across 6 counties of central Nebraska. He knew that machine the way a surgeon knows the bones of the hand. He knew what she sounded like when she was happy and what she sounded like when she was telling you something. He knew the particular shudder she made when the left final drive got warm, and he knew exactly how much throttle she'd take before the governor kicked her back. He'd rebuilt the undercarriage twice, replaced the blade twice. Put a third engine in her in 1964, a used 3306 block he'd found at a cat dealer in Grand Island for $1,100, and machined 2 of the pistons himself on the lathe he kept in the back of his shop. He had turned down an offer in 1968 to trade that D7 and $4,500 cash for a brand new Caterpillar D6C, turned it down flat. The dealer had called him foolish. Eldon had smiled his quiet smile and gone back to work. Now let me tell you about the other man in this story. Because every story worth telling has one. Raymond K. Brower was 38 years old, and he had been the lead project engineer for Morrison-Knudsen's Great Plains Division for 6 years. He had a civil engineering degree from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, a company truck with his name stenciled on the door, and the particular confidence of a man who has never once been seriously wrong about anything, at least not in his own recollection. Brower was not from the county, not from anywhere close to it. He'd grown up in Omaha, attended Lincoln on a scholarship, and had worked construction projects from Wyoming to Oklahoma. He was good at his job, let's be honest about that. He understood soil compaction tables and load-bearing mathematics and hydraulic force calculations. He could look at a geological survey and tell you within a reasonable margin what a formation was made of. What Raymond Brower could not do, what his education had never troubled itself to teach him, was look at an old man and an old machine and see anything but old. He'd driven out to assess the limestone shelf problem in mid-September, stood on the rim in his hard hat and clean boots, and delivered his verdict to Commissioner Hofstede and a small gathering of county officials with the smooth authority of a man who charged $85 an hour for his opinions. Gentlemen, he'd said, we're dealing with a lower Cretaceous limestone formation. Niobrara group most likely. Calcium carbonate content is going to be extremely high. You're not moving that shelf in one piece, and you're not moving it fast. We'll need to continue the ripping operation with the D9, bring in a second hydraulic hammer, and budget for an additional 4 to 6 weeks. This is geology. You can't argue with geology. He'd said you can't argue with geology the way some men say you can't argue with God, as if the statement itself ended the conversation and anyone who pushed back was simply not educated enough to understand the terms. When Commissioner Hofstede mentioned Eldon Pruitt's name, suggested maybe getting the old boy's opinion, seeing as how he'd worked limestone draws in the county for 20 years, Brower had looked at Hofstede the way a professor looks at a student who has just suggested something spectacularly uninformed. "Commissioner," he said, measuring each word like he was billing for them, "with respect, I don't need advice from a dirt farmer with a relic from the Truman administration. I need another hydraulic hammer and 2 more weeks." He drove back to his motel in Broken Bow. He had a call with the Home Office at 4 o'clock. He wasn't worried. The meeting happened on a Thursday morning, the 23rd of September, 1971. Hofstede had asked both men to be there, Brower and his crew foreman, a thick-armed Pole from Kearney named Kowalski, along with Eldon Pruitt, who arrived 45 minutes early and stood quietly at the rim of the draw with a cup of coffee from a thermos, just looking at the limestone shelf. Just looking at it. He'd been there perhaps 20 minutes when Brower pulled up. The engineer climbed out of his truck, clocked the old man in the worn canvas coat and the John Deere cap, the irony of which was not lost on anyone who knew Eldon didn't own a single John Deere machine, and walked over. "You the dozer man?" Brower asked. "That's right," Eldon said. "Eldon Pruitt." "That's right." Brower looked at him for a moment, looked at the thermos, looked back at the limestone shelf below. "How long have you been standing here?" "Little while," Eldon said. "And what's your assessment?" Eldon took a sip of his coffee. "I'd want to look at it from the bottom of the drawer first." Brower nodded the nod of a man who is being patient with someone who doesn't quite grasp the situation. "Sure, well, once you've had a look, you'll understand what we're working with. This isn't a pond bank or a county road terrace, Mr. Pruitt. This is Niobrara limestone. We're talking about formation that's been here since the Cretaceous period." "I know," Eldon said. "We've had a D9G on it for 3 weeks. I heard. Biggest production dozer Cat makes. I know what a D9 is." Brower paused. He wasn't used to being answered in such even, short sentences by a man he was trying to impress with large facts. He recalibrated. "What are you running?" "D7, Eldon said. "A D7, Brower repeated it, not a question, more like a doctor repeating a symptom back to confirm he'd heard it correctly. "What year?" 47. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man trying to decide whether to be kind or honest, and choosing a version of honesty that felt kind to him. "Mr. Pruitt, with all due respect, a 1947 D7 produces somewhere around 80 horsepower at the drawbar. The D9G we have down there produces 320 horsepower. I don't see how." "Can I walk down and look at the shelf?" Eldon asked. Brower gestured toward the access road. "Be my guest." What happened next is the part that people who were there still talk about. Eldon Pruitt walked down into that limestone draw, set his coffee thermos on a flat rock, and spent 22 minutes looking at the shelf. He didn't bring a survey instrument. He didn't bring a clipboard. He walked around it, crouched down beside it, ran his hands along the fracture lines that 3 weeks of D9 work had opened, pressed his palm flat against the face of it, and held it there for a long moment like he was taking its temperature. When he came back up, the county commissioner and 2 of his associates were there, along with Brower, Kowalski, and 2 members of the Morrison-Knudsen crew who'd wandered over during their break. "Well," Hofstede said. Eldon pulled his cap off, smoothed his hair back, put it on again. "I can move it," he said. The laughter started with one of the crew members. "Not mean, not yet, just the involuntary kind. The kind that happens when something strikes you as so far outside the range of possibility that your body responds before your manners can stop it." It spread to Kowalski, who at least had the decency to look at the ground when he laughed. Brower didn't laugh. He tilted his head slightly, the way an academic tilts his head when a student gives a wrong answer on an exam. "Mr. Pruitt," he said carefully, "you understand we have." "I heard you," Eldon said. "I can move it. Give me 3 days." "With a 1947 D7. "Yes." Now Brower did smile. It was a thin smile, educated. And what is it you believe you understand about this formation that 3 of my engineers and the latest Caterpillar equipment cannot resolve? Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a room, or in this case, a limestone draw in Custer County, Nebraska, where a quiet man says something and everyone laughs, where the room fills up with the comfortable noise of people who are very sure they know how the world works? Did you notice how quiet he stayed? Eldon Prout looked at Raymond Brower for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll tell you after I move it." That evening, Eldon Prout drove back to his farm east of Myrna. He went into his shop, a steel building he'd put up himself in 1958, 40 by 60 feet, with a concrete floor he'd poured one section at a time over 3 summers, and he went to work on the D7. Now, let me tell you something about what Eldon Prout understood that Raymond Brower's engineering degree had never mentioned. It was a matter of angle and a matter of timing. Eldon had spent 20 years working in limestone in Custer County, not surveying it, not analyzing it with instruments, working it. And in those 20 years, he had learned something that geologists knew in theory, but that only a man who had put iron against limestone 10,000 times truly understood in his hands and his gut. Niobrara limestone, the same formation Brower had identified correctly to his credit, is not a uniform material. It has horizontal bedding planes, natural seams running through it like the pages of a closed book. Those seams are the weakness, not the top face, not the front face, the bedding plane. The Morrison-Knudsen crew had been attacking the shelf from the front and from the top, 320 horsepower pushing straight into the limestone, hydraulic hammers pounding down on it. They were reading the book from the cover. Eldon had seen, in 22 minutes of looking and touching and reading that formation the way he'd read every formation he'd ever worked, that the primary bedding plane ran at approximately a 12-degree angle, tilted slightly toward the southwest. He'd seen the fracture lines the D9 had opened, and he understood something the engineers hadn't considered. Those fractures, as frustrating as they'd been, had done something valuable. They'd relieved internal stress in the shelf. They'd created what Eldon would have called, in his plain language, a starting point. If you could get a blade into that bedding plane at the right angle and apply force along the plane rather than against it, you weren't fighting the rock. You were convincing them. And the D7, his specific D7 with its particular blade geometry, could do something the D9G could not. The D9G was a magnificent machine, powerful beyond argument, but its sheer size and the geometry of its blade meant that in the confined approach to that shelf in the angle of the draw, it could not get low enough and angled enough to find that bedding plane. It was like trying to open a sliding door by pushing on it from the front. Eldon's D7 was smaller, lower, and in 20 years Eldon had modified the blade pitch on that machine, not from any engineering calculation, but from feel, from trial and error, from listening to what the machine told him through his feet and his hands, in a way that gave it an attack angle 3 to 5 degrees lower than factory specification. He'd had a CAT mechanic look at it once back in the early 60s. The mechanic had frowned and said, "Eldon, that's not how it's supposed to sit." Eldon had said, "I know, works better this way." The mechanic had shaken his head. Eldon had kept working. That night in the shop, he made 2 more adjustments. He tightened the blade tilt hydraulics. The D7 had a manually adjustable tilt, and he set it with a specific 3-inch bias to the right that he calculated without a calculator would give him the approach vector he wanted on the southwest face of the shelf. He replaced a worn hydraulic fitting on the right tilt cylinder that had been giving him intermittent pressure loss. He checked the track tension on both sides and let 2 pounds of air out of the seat cushion because he'd be running at a sustained angle, and he needed to feel the ground through the machine without being bounced. He was in the shop until 11:30 at night. His wife, Loretta, brought him a plate of pork chops and green beans at 9 o'clock and set it on the workbench without a word. She'd been married to him for 28 years. She knew when he was working through something, and she knew the difference between troubled and focused. This was focused. She patted his shoulder once, went back inside, and let him work. The morning of Friday, September 24, 1971, arrived the way the best mornings do in central Nebraska, cold and clear, the grass silver with frost, the sky already going pink and orange in the east while it was still purple overhead. The temperature was 31 degrees at 6 a.m. in Broken Bow. The forecast said partly cloudy, winds out of the northwest at 12 miles per hour, high near 58. Eldon had his D7 on the trailer by 5:45. He ran a 1963 International Harvester 180 as his haul truck, a 3-axle flatbed he'd put together from a wrecked IH cab and a trailer he'd bought from a pipeline company going out of business. And he had the rig at the Custer County Road Department Yard, which was serving as staging for the Morrison-Knudsen job, by 7 a.m. Commissioner Hofstede was there. He'd come early, Eldon suspected, because he was the one who'd made the call, and he was the one whose reputation was riding on whether this worked or whether it turned into an embarrassing story told at the county commission meetings for the next 10 years. Brower arrived at 7:30, coffee in hand and a clean hard hat. He had brought 2 of his engineers. He had also, and this is the detail that tells you everything you need to know about Raymond Brower's character in that moment, brought a county road department employee named Doug Pfeiffer, who Brower apparently trusted to serve as a neutral witness to what he expected to be Eldon Pruitt's failure. Brower watched Eldon unload the D7 from the trailer, watched the old machine roll off the ramps, tracks clanking on the frozen ground, a pale blue haze of diesel smoke drifting out behind her in the cold air. She was, by any objective standard, an ugly machine by 1971. Her paint had faded to a color that occupied the space between rust and brown. Her blade had a weld repair on the left cutting edge that Eldon had made himself, a bead of weld you could see from 20 feet. The cab, if you could call it that, because it was an open ROPS frame, no doors, no glass, was hung with a canvas wind curtain on the left side that Eldon had sewn himself from an old tarpaulin. One of Brower's engineers said something quietly to the other one. Both of them smiled. Let me tell you about the sound of that D7. If you have never been close to a running 1947 Caterpillar D7, and most people alive today have not, you need to understand that it does not sound like the machines you see on job sites today. Modern equipment sounds precise, hydraulic, managed. The 1947 D7 sounds like an intention. It has a cadence to it, a deep, rhythmic clatter thrum that you feel in your chest more than you hear with your ears. When Eldon brought her throttle up that morning, when that old 3306 block warmed through and found its rhythm in the cold air, the sound rolled across that limestone draw and bounced back off the far wall and seemed to fill up the whole valley. Brower crossed his arms. Eldon did not look at Brower, he did not look at anyone. He put on his canvas work gloves, settled into the seat, and began his approach to the draw. Here is what happened over the next 4 hours. Eldon's first pass was not a push. It was a reading. He brought the D7 down into the draw at a walking pace, blade slightly raised, and he ran the machine along the base of the limestone shelf for its full length, about 60 feet at barely above idle. Just listening, just feeling. Then he backed up, shifted the blade to his preset tilt angle, and came around on an oblique approach, not straight at the shelf, but at an angle of roughly 40 degrees to its face, targeting the southwest corner. Brower checked his watch. What is he doing? He asked Hofstede quietly. Working, Hofstede said. The first serious pass happened at 8:42 a.m. Eldon brought the D7 in at 3/4 throttle, not full, deliberately not full, with the blade pitched low and biased right, aimed at the southwest corner of the shelf where his eyes and hands had told him the bedding plane was thinnest and most accessible. He hit the rock at an angle, and the entire machine shuddered. You could hear the tracks scramble momentarily on the limestone floor of the draw, and then something happened. A crack, not the sharp, explosive crack of a hydraulic hammer impact, something lower. Something that seemed to come from inside the rock, a groan almost, like something ancient being asked to move for the first time. The shelf didn't move, but it spoke. Eldon backed off, circled, came in again from the same angle, this time pushing with full throttle. The D7's exhaust stack throwing black smoke straight up into the cold morning air. The tracks churned. The blade buried itself into that corner of the shelf and stayed there, and the engine sound, that deep, rhythmic clatterthrum dropped in pitch, became something more like a moan, as every pound of force that old machine could generate pushed against 24 feet of Niobrara limestone. And then slowly, almost reluctantly, the southwest corner of the shelf moved. It did not break apart, it did not shatter. It rotated, pivoting on the bedding plane the way a door pivots on a hinge, and a section approximately 8 feet wide separated from the main shelf face with a sound like the earth clearing its throat. Brower took a step forward, just one step, unconscious, his arms uncrossed. Eldon backed up, repositioned, came in along the exposed bedding plane that his first pass had opened, blade now flat and angled to follow the natural fracture line running northeast through the shelf. This time, when he pushed, it was almost surgical. He wasn't fighting the rock anymore, he was guiding it. The fracture propagated along the bedding plane. You could see it run, a dark line spreading through the gray limestone face like a crack through old plaster, and another section, 12 feet wide, separated and tilted forward into the draw with a sound like a bookcase falling over. Then another. Then the main mass of the shelf, the section that the D9G had beaten against for 3 weeks without result, suddenly had no support on its southwest corner, no lateral connection on its northeast face, and was standing on a bedding plane that had been undermined along 60% of its length. Eldon Prout did not rush. He repositioned the D7 3 more times, each time working the blade into a specific location that, from the rim of the draw, appeared random but was anything but. He was following a sequence he had worked out the night before in his shop, standing in front of that limestone shelf in his mind, the way a chess player works through a sequence of moves. At 11:17 a.m., 2 hours and 35 minutes after his first serious push, Eldon brought the D7 in for what he knew was the last pass. Full throttle, dead center on the remaining mass of the shelf. But the blade was pitched to follow the bedding plane he had exposed, and the angle was exactly 12 degrees below horizontal, the angle he had read with his hands on a cold September morning 3 days earlier. The D7 hit the shelf. The shelf moved. Not a section, not a piece. The remaining mass, an estimated 180 tons of Niobrara limestone, according to the Morrison-Knudsen survey, rotated on its bedding plane and fell forward into the draw in one piece, splitting cleanly along its base and settling into the exact location the channel excavation required. The dust cloud rose 40 feet into the cold Nebraska sky. The sound reached the rim of the draw approximately 2 seconds after the impact, rolling up through the limestone walls like something waking up after a long sleep. Eldon Prout throttled back to idle. He reached up and turned off the key. The old D7 ticked and cooled in the sudden silence of the drawer. Nobody said anything for a long time. Not Hofstede, not the county associates, not Kowalski, the foreman, who was a practical man who understood equipment and who had spent the last 3 weeks learning the hard way what that shelf would and would not do. Brower stood at the rim of the draw with his coffee cup still in his hand and looked at 180 tons of limestone lying exactly where it needed to lie, cleanly split from its formation, dust still drifting off it in the northwest breeze. Eldon climbed down from the D7. He picked up his thermos from the equipment case behind the seat, unscrewed the top, and poured himself a cup of coffee. He stood next to his machine, drinking it, looking at the shelf the way a man looks at a finished field, not with pride exactly, with satisfaction. The quiet satisfaction of work that went the way you knew it would go if you just took the time to understand what you were working with. He did not look up at the rim. He did not look at Brower. He finished his coffee, screwed the top back on the thermos, and climbed back up into the D7 seat to start clearing the broken limestone from the channel route. Doug Pfeiffer, the county road employee whom Brower had brought as a witness, said later that he was standing right next to Brower when it happened. Said that the engineer's face didn't show embarrassment exactly, or anger. What it showed was something harder to name. The look, Pfeiffer said, of a man who has just had a very expensive education. Brower set his coffee cup down on the hood of his truck. He walked down the access road into the draw. He walked up to Eldon Prout, who was running the D7 at idle, and he waited until Eldon looked at him. "Mr. Prout," Brower said, loudly enough to be heard over the engine, "you said you'd tell me after you moved it. What did you know?" Eldon looked at him for a moment, then he said, "Bedding plane runs 12 degrees southwest. Your D9 was pushing into it. Mine went with it." Brower nodded slowly. "The fractures your machine opened," Eldon said, "that was the real work. You broke the stress. I just finished it." Brower nodded again. Something shifted in his face. It was not an easy shift for a man like that. "How did you know the angle?" Eldon looked at the rock. "Put my hand on it," he said. He throttled up the D7 and went back to work. "Let me pause here and ask you something. In your life, in your work, in your family, in the quiet moments when you've had to decide whether to trust what you know against what someone with a title and a clipboard says, Have you ever had a moment like Eldon Pruitt's moment in that drawer? That moment where the world goes quiet and the thing you've spent 20 years learning turns out to be worth something after all. I want you to hold that feeling for a moment, because what comes next is where this story lives. The channel excavation at the Custer County 7 North project was completed on schedule, actually 3 days ahead of schedule after Eldon cleared the limestone shelf. The Morrison-Knudsen crew, to their credit, worked efficiently once the primary obstruction was removed. The irrigation channel opened in the spring of 1972 and delivered water to approximately 11,200 acres of Custer County farmland for decades afterward. The county paid Eldon Pruitt $2,400 for his 3 days of work. He tried to refuse anything beyond a day rate of $45 an hour, which had been their verbal agreement. Hofstede insisted on the $2,400, said it was fair. Eldon took it. He bought Loretta a new Kenmore washing machine with part of it. She'd been asking for 3 years. Now, let me tell you what happened to the people in this story. Commissioner Gerald Hofstede served 3 more terms in Custer County and retired in 1983. He kept a photograph of the limestone draw on the wall of his office for the rest of his career. He said it reminded him of something important about how to find the right man for a job. Raymond Brower continued to work for Morrison-Knudsen for another 4 years. He was good at his job. He'd been right about the geology, Niobrara limestone, bedding plain, all of it. He'd been wrong about something harder to put on a survey form. In 1975, Brower left commercial construction and took a teaching position at the University of Nebraska Civil Engineering program, where he taught, by multiple accounts, a thoughtful and well-regarded course in practical soil and rock mechanics. Former students remember him saying on more than one occasion that the most important instrument in a geologist's toolkit was one you couldn't buy from any equipment dealer. He never specified what he meant by that, but the students who had heard the story of Custer County thought they understood. The D7, the 1947 Caterpillar D7, serial number 37A6849, rust-red and wire-braced and held together by 20 years of a quiet man's attention, kept working. Eldon ran her until 1979. He did a full undercarriage rebuild in the spring of 1976, which cost him $3,100 in parts and 3 weeks of his own labor. He replaced the blade for the 3rd time in 1978, a used blade he found at an auction in Gothenburg, Nebraska, for $380, which he adapted to fit with welding work he did himself. In 1979, his son Gerald, who had come back to the farm after 2 years at Northeast Community College, expressed an interest in learning the dozer work. Eldon began teaching him. Gerald proved to be a quick student. He had his father's hands. The farm crisis of the early 1980s hit Custer County as hard as it hit every agricultural community across the Great Plains. Corn prices that had been $2.90 a bushel in 1980 collapsed to $1.75 by 1986. Land values fell by 40%. Farmers who had borrowed heavily during the expansion years of the 1970s, men who had done everything right by every indicator available at the time, found themselves unable to make their payments. Eldon Pruitt was not among them. He had never borrowed against his land, had never, in 30 years of farming, taken on a line of credit he didn't know he could service with 2 bad years in a row. He had been called conservative by neighbors during the boom years, cautious, old-fashioned. He had called himself careful. During the farm crisis, Eldon and Gerald took on custom work across 5 counties: terracing, pond clearing, creek work, all the maintenance that cash-strapped farmers couldn't afford to let slide if they wanted to keep their operations viable. They worked from March to November, 6 days a week. They kept their rates fair. They kept their word. The D7 worked through all of it. In 1984, a writer from the Broken Bow Custer County Chief newspaper did a piece on Eldon's custom work business, by then operating under the name Pruitt Land and Leveling, and asked him about the old D7. How old was she? Had he ever thought about upgrading? "She's 37 years old," Eldon said. "When she stops doing what I need her to do, I'll think about it." The writer asked if he had any advice for younger farmers struggling through the crisis. Eldon thought about it for a while, long enough that the writer wondered if he was going to answer. Then he said, know your ground, don't borrow what you can't pay back in a bad year, and don't let anybody tell you something's impossible just because their equipment says it is. The writer put that in the paper. The editor considered whether to cut it for length. He didn't. People clipped it out and put it on their refrigerators across the county. Eldon Pruitt died on March 14, 1991, at the age of 72 from congestive heart failure. He died in the house where he had been born, in the bed his parents had bought the year they were married. Loretta was with him. He was buried in the Myrna Cemetery in Custer County, Nebraska. The service was attended by approximately 200 people, not a large number in the way city people count attendance, but for a man who lived on a section of ground east of a small Nebraska town and ran a crawler and raised cattle and kept his word for 50 years, 200 people is a very large number indeed. Gerald Pruitt continued the farm, continued the custom work. He still has the D7. Last time anyone checked, she still runs. Let me tell you what I think about when I think about Eldon Pruitt. I don't think about the limestone shelf first. I don't think about the engineers or the county commissioner or the moment when 180 tons of Niobrara rock fell where 3 weeks of modern equipment couldn't make it fall. Those are good things to think about. They're the parts that make a good story. But what I think about first is the 22 minutes. The 22 minutes that Eldon Pruitt spent in that limestone draw before he said a single word to anyone, before he made a single claim, before he told Raymond Brower or anyone else what he was going to do. He looked, he listened, he put his hand on the rock. Now, Raymond Brower had been in that drawer too. He'd been in it with instruments and survey teams and a geological education from one of the better universities in the state. He'd read the formation correctly in every measurable way. He had the right vocabulary for what he was looking at. What he didn't have was 20 years of conversation with limestone. And that's the thing about knowledge that doesn't come from a book or a course or a degree. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't walk into a meeting with a briefcase and a neatly laminated credential. It walks in with worn work gloves and a 24-year-old machine that leaks a little hydraulic fluid and sounds like it's disagreeing with you every time you push the throttle. We live in a world that has gotten very good at credentialing, at certifying, at measuring expertise by the instruments you carry and the organizations that have approved your methods. And those things matter. Raymond Brower was a genuinely competent engineer. His instruments were accurate. His geology was sound. But competence and wisdom are not the same thing, and instruments and hands are not the same thing, and knowing the name of a problem and knowing how to solve it are not, have never been, will never be, the same thing. Eldon Pruitt had been solving problems with limestone for 20 years before that morning in September of 1971. Every one of those problems had taught him something. Not in a classroom, not in a laboratory. In a draw or a field or a creek bed in rain and heat and early frost, with an old machine that told him through his feet and his back and his hands what was working and what wasn't. That is not an education you can accelerate. That is not a knowledge you can download or summarize or earn in a semester. It is the kind of knowledge that only accumulates in one way, slowly, through honest work, day after day, year after year, failure by failure and success by success. Let me tell you one more thing. The man who laughed first, the Morrison-Knudsen crew member who started the laughter in that limestone draw when Eldon said he could move the shelf, his name was Dale Renner. He was 26 years old in 1971. He was a good equipment operator. He went on to have a long career in the construction industry. In 1988, Dale Renner was working a job site in Dawson County, Nebraska, and ran into a situation with a buried clay formation that his equipment simply would not resolve. A retired farmer, an old man, 70 years old if a day, happened to be watching from the road. Dale waved him over. The old man looked at the problem for a while, put his hands in the dirt. Then he told Dale exactly how to approach it. It worked. Dale Renner said later that he'd thought about Eldon Pruitt that day, said he'd thought about what it costs a young man, what it costs any of us, to assume that the old way and the slow way and the worn-out-looking way can't possibly be the right way. He said he hoped he'd gotten a little smarter about that. I think most of us are still working on it. And that's all right. The work of getting wiser is not so different from the work of moving limestone. You put your hand on it, you find the bedding plane, you stop fighting it and start listening to it. And then when you're ready, when you really know, you push.